It's hard to figure out the mechanics of a power system for certain, because no matter what, it's always still your interpretation, and the author always has the freedom to go in another direction if they ever want to. But the difference between a story's plot and a universe's mechanics is that those rules are designed to allow the story to intuitively take place. So when a specific mechanic is decided, it's already been thought through to make sure it fits with the rest of the world, and usually, it's meant to stay consistent so people can continue understanding the story, unless it's story relevant to change how the universe seems to work. When there is a debate about a specific detail of a power system, while you can never know for sure, the best answer you can find would come from looking at the wider principles of the setting that this detail is meant to build off of, and then considering what this detail's purpose is for the story. Without needing to be told the inner workings, you can outline what this mechanic is supposed to be from the outside by matching what concepts it would function through in universe with what role it fulfills in the story out of universe. The stand arrows use certain mechanics in JoJo's universe to grant stands, and those stands also follow certain principles. So to understand the ideas behind the arrows, it would be good to see how their functions relate to the original ideas behind stands. In real life, which JoJo as fiction builds off of, the more mass something has, the more gravity it has. And in space, light debris floats around, but if enough winds up in one place, they'd pull on each other and clump together into something larger and heavier. Then an object the size of a planet has enough gravity to bend smaller objects like meteors toward it. In JoJo's universe, the supernatural makes it so that influence, or potential, counts as a mystical type of mass. So things with a lot of significance show a special type of gravity, where instead of a force-bending matter, it's how the presence of a person or object can bend what will happen around them. It's a type of gravity for fate. And if your influence is so strong that you're like a planet compared to ordinary people and your natural surroundings, which would be meteors, you would be able to do what planets do and pull their weight into yours or bend them around your position. So this manifests as a power to conjure whatever your form of influence on the world is, known as a stand. And other stand users would also have planet-level gravity, so instead of bending around you, they would have mutual pull with their own stand powers, so you would be more easily drawn to each other, but able to avoid fully crashing by being able to see each other's stands and attack an enemy before they can activate their power. And just like how money and status can grant you opportunities, so someone born to rich parents can start out with more opportunities than most, influence would spread to descendants, which is how children of stand users can be born with dormant powers. Money and influence are relative, and a property of relativity is that as long as something is gate-kept, you can multiply it. If influence is about having more influence than others, then as long as you make sure there is a group that does not have a certain level of power, you can add more people to your level without sacrificing any amount of power each of you have over the group still beneath you. So as long as they don't fumble, stand users can have stand user children and increase the number of stand powers they have access to. But this property can also be exploited to make someone a stand user, if they're not one already, by getting something with high influence that can pierce people and spread its level of significance to them. This seems to be how the stand arrows are meant to work. A material so special it has high significance to the whole world, sharpened into an arrow so it can reliably and accurately puncture people. Then, as long as they have the strength to hold themselves together under their new higher gravity, without collapsing and being destroyed by it, they'll become a stand user. Because influence comes from two sources. You need opportunities, but also the strength of character to act on them. So as long as you have some aggression to get your way in life, you can be a stand user, which means if you survive the injury from the arrow, you can handle awakening a stand. But if you have enough aggression to overpower the injury dealt by the arrow, you can bend its trajectory for the future and reverse it. And because the arrows work by their material itself having a higher level of fate gravity, they can be pulled into people they're in contact with, and as long as it's sharpened, you only need a small piece to cleanly awaken a stand. But it would also mean a special feature happens when enough of the material is clumped together into one object. If stand arrows run through fate gravity, then the more material you incorporate into a single-directed sculpture, the more mass would pool and build a higher level of gravity, meaning the arrow would have more influence itself, which means if someone knows how to use it right, then a full arrow would seem to have its own presence and sort of come to life. The arrows are tools used by people, their future being based on who the user would want to fire at, so their influence would revolve around someone's will, like a moon orbiting a planet. And somebody letting the arrow do its thing for them could use it like a sort of metal detector and magnet by weaponizing its power over fate, because a full arrow would be pulled toward people nearby whenever firing it in that direction would cause a development in the near future that would be in the user's favor. Yoshihiro used the arrow to awaken more stand users to fight against Josuke's group, so the arrow kept being drawn to situations where it would either awaken stands that would be fated to be useful to Kira, like Stray Cat, or stands that would end up inconveniencing Josuke's team, even if unintentionally, like with Boy to Man and Cheap Trick. Even puncturing Mikitaka led to Rohan's house being burned down. But the limit of the arrow is that it can only line up so far into the future. It only has so much mass, and it's only carved so well to be so aggressive. So based on the ideas behind the arrow, the more material it would be made from, and the more intricately it would be sculpted together into one full shape, the more significant and sensitive it would be, so the farther and more precisely into the future it would be able to align itself. Which makes you wonder, since it was deliberately chosen to be added to the series, would there be any difference between the flat arrows and the bug one introduced in Part 5? It's chunkier, it's so intricately carved that it has a full bug sculpture protruding from it, and it was introduced implying a parallel between it and the creation of the Aja mask. The design of Part 5's arrow could be symbolic. In JoJo's, appearances almost always are, but sometimes symbolism is tied to functionality. So to get the best sense of what the bug arrow is supposed to be, functionally, it would be good to go over what role it's supposed to play in the story. Taking the context of the entire series so far into account, in Part 1, JoJo's world was established, with a sort of cosmic horror feel, where a tool tied to secret underlying mechanics reality and organic life run on draws people to evil and causes chaos. Aside from the importance of fate, and that the Joestars represent role models for justice, we learn that the power living beings get from the food chain can be flipped to give someone disproportionate powers over their own life and over others, through stealing from them. And it seems to be the first case of a core principle of JoJo's, where through supernatural mechanics, things that have influential mass, this fate gravity, get actual power because of it, so sources of power get symbolized, such as the food chain being sun energy that chains through living beings like lightning. Part 2 shows a guy who made a tool to be able to tap into this power, but it's not just meant to awaken it, because he's working on a more precise version of that tool, using the mechanics behind it that can evolve the power to perfection for someone who already has it. Part 3 then shows that, separate from a universal concept like the food chain, if someone individually has enough distinct influence, it can take its own form as a unique power. And then Part 4 introduces the arrows as a way stands can be granted to existing people like the main characters. Because if someone's existence is entangled with someone else's, it makes sense that boosting their significance would boost that other person's as well, which would explain how Dio using a stand arrow could awaken stands in the Joestars back in Part 3. But for story purposes, the first arrow in Part 4 is a mechanism to give ordinary people extra power as a way to test them and make them lessons for the audience. Because Part 4 is about how, even if you're hindered or disadvantaged in some way, you should put in the extra effort so you can still cooperate with society. The main character is a guy with anger issues, who, instead of enabling them, goes through hoops to regulate his anger and make sure he's doing good for his society, which means he gets more people who would want to help him over time, growing the power and size of his community. So when Keicho, a kid who got his hands on the arrow without learning how to use it, starts attacking various civilians to awaken stands in them, we end up with a bunch of tropes of different types of regular people who start unfairly using their powers on others for their own interests when they awaken them. But Josuke and Koichi use their powers of justice and community to then overpower, reform, and then welcome them, growing the size of their society of stand users on the side of justice. This is contrasted by the main villain, Kira, who has impulses like Josuke, but embraces them at the cost of the rest of society, using innocent people to fulfill them instead. So he relies on his individual advantages to contest with Josuke's strength of numbers. But this means that he slowly uses advantages up for momentary gains, while Josuke accumulates more. This is the story purpose of the second arrow. Yoshihiro and Yoshikage use this advantage of power over people they could awaken stands in to get residents of Morio to attack Josuke's group. But Josuke's community absorbs them, reducing Kira's advantages and slowly backing him into a corner. So once again, when he's out of options, Kira uses up the remaining advantage he has. The arrow, under Yoshihiro's goal of supporting Kira, is pulled into him, crashing and destroying itself like a meteorite to add its mass, its influence, to his. So Kira is able to get a power for something he didn't have influence over when backed into that corner. But because it's not from an extension of his own potential, it came from the arrow, he can't use it with his core powers. He has to swap between them. He wasn't able to achieve the purpose of Bites the Dust with his own base stand. But all the power-up does is buy him more time, because fundamentally, he's still instinctively using things up, whereas Josuke puts in the effort to work with them. So then, in Part 5, the story is about when a stronger power like Josuke's is against you. So you start with the game over disadvantage Kira reaches. Someone has taken over society, and they're suffocating the influences of everyone beneath them, which means you don't have the same level of strength to win against them in a tug of war. And unless you get lucky, you won't actually have any potential to beat them. You need luck, a miracle, a jackpot outside of your hands to find a path to victory. So Part 5 is about how you should fight for what you believe in and never give up. Because even if you can't see any way out, you only have a chance of playing a royal flush if you take the risk to play your cards. And gambling is necessary when justice has no choice but to win, because Diavolo suppresses those beneath him, so nobody can harm him. He fights to keep everyone else in the dark, and to them, his false empire only takes away from their lives and potential. A true king would have an actual throne above others, without needing to actively keep everyone else down, only having to exert power over individual threats to resolve them, while letting their people breathe and freely grow the rest of the time. And they wouldn't have to take action themselves, because as a true king, they would have forces to fight for them. This is the idea behind the Requiem power-up. Rather than an arrow destroying itself to give its mass to you, the arrow is significant and stable enough that its gravity can hold its own against a stand user. So it's meant to be wielded because it's a tool, but it wouldn't be destroyed to buff somebody unworthy. Instead, there's a tug of war between the aggression of the user and the pull of the arrow. So if the user is worthy, the arrow will orbit around them, and since it has planet-level gravity that can contest with another stand user, the thing it revolves around would be elevated to star-level gravity, granting the user a true level of power over planet-level stand users. But if they're unworthy, then their influence will revolve around the arrows instead, letting the arrow reach sun level through hijacking their stand. Requiem uses the autonomy of the arrow instead of consuming it, so when it's tamed by the user, a higher level of stand powers can act on their behalf. So aside from style reasons, no wonder Requiem's stats are 0. Stand stats are how well a person can use their stand ability, and Requiem is a separate influence working for you from within your stand's original body, so Requiem itself is disconnected from that process. But if this is meant to be a power of a king, something fully above normal stand users, then symbolically, for the story of Part 5, it wouldn't be that Requiem represents a hidden path someone could take with any stand arrow, or the last resort out of narrowing options, It would fit the best if the arrow is special because it's symbolic of a hidden gem. And that's what it is because when Giorno tames it, it becomes a crown jewel for his reign as king. Something valuable to cement his rule, which is why it becomes an ornament on Gold Experience's forehead, and Gold Experience's Requiem's head resembles a crown. And also why Giorno's hair at the start of the story turned gold when he got close to the pull of a rival stand user and formed a bunch of gem slots. Cause he has the potential to be a true king, with the power to grow stuff beneath him, who just needs a hidden gem to be able to properly crown himself. So the implication is that this Requiem arrow, made out of a more special material with more complex carving, and introduced to fulfill this role in the story, would be more intense and stable than a normal arrow. Stand arrows have hidden uses to evolve stands further, like with Bites the Dust. But this Requiem arrow has the power to take down an organization, which is what Giorno's group need to beat Diavolo, and why Polnareff approaches their first conversation through the idea that they need his arrow in particular. At least, if this is the case, and the arrow is more influential and sensitive, as its structure would suggest, then you'd think this would be clarified by reintroducing it later in the story, where it can specifically show how even its regular stand arrow functions would be more exaggerated than a flat arrow's, which, based on the principles any stand arrow seems to work through, would happen in two ways. First, aggression. Being heavier and more directed from having more material and complex carving, the arrow would flood a target with more influence and cause awakenings more easily. We're deliberately told it's sensitive enough that even grazing a stand can start the Requiem process, but to awaken a base stand, it would flood a person with influence completely, which would be harder to see in someone punctured by it, but in a case where someone unlocks a stand by being entangled with a different person punctured by it, maybe instead of slowly awakening their stand sometime later on like the Joestars, the influence of the arrow would be so aggressive they would receive their own physical wound from it. And we see Weather get a full imprint of the arrowhead the moment Pucci is pierced before he immediately awakens Weather Report. But second would be fate alignment. The normal arrows can act like close-range magnets to align themselves with nearby situations, where firing them would awaken a stand that would chain react to cause an outcome the user would prefer in the near future. But rather than just pulling into nearby opportunities when they arise, an arrow with more sensitivity and influence over fate would have a wider range through both space and time to align itself. It would be able to generally direct its user toward ideal targets over farther distances, like a compass, to align them with a future where the best target would awaken something closer to the exact type of power they're looking for, even if this would take a longer chain of events spanning further into the future to occur, which is exactly how Dio uses the arrow in Part 6. Since Dio missed Part 2, and fitting the idea of it being a hidden gem in Part 5, it would be understandable for him to think that a fireable arrow that's clunkier with unnecessary carvings would be a prototype, or better for another function like searching. So he locates Pucci across the world and leaves the arrow with him to awaken Whitesnake in the perfect moment way later in the future. But the idea that this arrow is stronger than the rest of the stand arrows is necessary to conclude Part 6's story and even support its whole theme in the first place. Because Part 6 following Part 5 is about when you don't have a lucky break, like a hidden gem, where you can still overpower the advantages of your enemy. They really do have all the power in the world. Victory is completely in their hands, and your opportunities only come from what they give you or fail to realize. How do you still win when your enemies have every advantage to overpower you? And Stone Ocean's answer is you use the fact that since your enemies are also individual people, rather than the forces of nature they weaponize, they disproportionately have influence over so much more stuff around them than they can individually keep track of, which means they can't pay as much attention to the numerous more consequences of their actions in their blind spot. So you can use their blind spot to get them to make their own chain reactions work against them. This is how Part 6 concludes, with an enemy Pucci didn't realize was born from his act of trapping stand users in his prison, surviving his heaven plan, and using Pucci's short-sightedness to trick him into granting this enemy power. Emporio represents Pucci's weak point, but also symbolic of this, the power Emporio is granted to beat Pucci should be another unintended consequence of his actions that outweighs and is stronger than his intended consequences, which is the whole idea of weather report. The weather is the activity of the wider environment around you, so weather report symbolizes how someone can have so much influence, they have consistent power over that. And the theme in common for the Part 6 team is that they all have powers around Stone Ocean's separation of external opportunity and internal fighting spirit. If part of your power in life comes from your circumstances, then what are different ways people would be able to struggle against that? Hermes splitting things in two and dedicating herself to revenge to sneak attack someone who thought he'd dealt with all of his obstacles. FF only given life by Pucci and the remains of other people, manipulating her body and shooting it as projectiles to change her life's purpose and ally with Jolene. And Asui, whose life also pivots around and regains hope through Jolene, but whose only influence is inward, which is why he needs Jolene to give him an external source of light. Jolene herself, who is bound too much by fate and can only ever manipulate her own body, so she needs the environment to still be somewhat on her side and is doomed when Pucci awakens his all-powerful stand. And Emporio, who just like FF, Hermes, and Jolene, was a blind spot in a butterfly effect, but he's depended on what he's known, the safety of the ghost room within the prison he was born in. He needs to grow past his reliance on the comfort of a cage to beat Pucci, which he does by substituting his actual stand with the power over your surrounding opportunity. Weather Report, the stand, represents Weather's battle over and manual strength to harness his automatic influence over his wider circumstances, lashing out at the thing that gives you power in the first place. So his manual side takes a physical stand form that turns into clouds and integrates itself into the weather, but the automatic side centers environmental effects around him, but can span as far as the atmosphere to do so. Pucci's actions to puppeteer the fate of their town revolved around Weather, without him having any awareness or control. And Weather never stopped struggling against symptoms of Pucci's interference, which led to Pucci awakening both of their stands. But he would only be able to get a power over the whole environment around him with an extraordinarily superior amount of influence. And that's why it matters which stand arrow gave them their abilities. Not only would Part 5's arrow be the spiritually heaviest of them all, its mechanics would also be relevant to the theme of Stone Ocean, because increasing the power and precision of the arrow wouldn't make the stand it awakens any stronger. It would improve its control first, so how accurately and finely it could awaken the wielder's ideal stand, overdumping its full level of influence into a target. But its blind spot would be any additional person its target is tethered to. If the arrow's priority is getting the exact stand it wants from a target, so it precisely gives them the proper amount of influence, a person tethered to them would get all of this stronger arrow's loose excess influence, which would be disproportionately higher than the amount given to the person in its field of view. Weather Report as a stand, and the whole idea of Stone Ocean depend on Part 5's arrow being stronger than a flat one, which it would be based on the ideas behind the arrows, which come from the original ideas behind stands. This wouldn't mean that there's only one arrow that can unlock Requiem. It's just the difference between tennis shoes and snowshoes. On normal ground, snowshoes are still usable, but maybe a bit clunkier to wear. But because they're flatter, when someone wants to be able to walk on the surface of snow, they have more freedom wearing snowshoes, whereas with normal shoes, it's tough to not break through the snow and fall to the ground beneath. Requiem uses an arrow for a layer of stand power above normal stands. If the arrow isn't as big and imposing, then unless you find some sort of workaround, the power-up won't be as stable or easy to activate, and it wouldn't have the same degree of power. At least, that's going off of how the arrows seem to work, and the reasons they were included in JoJo's overall story.